The first thing to do is not to fear fat. We've all grown up fearing that fat in your food and your bacon and your cheese is going to become the fat on your body. It's what I call the tragic homonym. The fat you eat and the fat you get. You do not get fat from eating fat. So that basic fear you have to overcome. What translates into fatty acids in your bloodstream actually are carbohydrates. They convert into fatty acids in your blood.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada-Gore. This is episode 45, and my guest is Nina Teicholz. Nina is an investigative journalist and the author of The Big Fat Surprise. It has been an international and New York Times bestseller, and the year it was released, The Economist called it the #1 science book of 2014. It was one of the first publications that made the case for why saturated fats, the kind found in dairy, meat, and eggs, are not bad for our health. In today's conversation, Nina expounds on this important topic. Before we dive into it, we want to recognize our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported by Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products, offering fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Go to greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. The foundation is holding its annual conference in Montgomery, Alabama this year, November 11th to the 13th. It's called Nutrition for All Seasons of Life, and there's going to be something for everybody. Join us, learn, eat well, and have fun. Go to wisetraditions.org to register. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Nina.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
Nina, I understand you spent a decade researching dietary fat and nutrition policy to write your book. What made you get interested in this topic in the first place?
Well, it does seem like a crazy amount of time to spend reading thousands of nutrition science papers. And there were a couple of things that interested me. One was something just kind of off the wall, which is that when I moved to New York, I started doing this restaurant review column for this little neighborhood newspaper, and we couldn't afford to pay for meals. So we had to just eat whatever. I just had to eat whatever the chefs wanted to send out to me. And it turned out, I was a vegetarian at the time, like I would have ordered, maybe chicken breast or vegetables, a vegetable-based dish, but it turns out chefs do not want to send out. What they're interested in showcasing often are, meat or trifle or creamy sauces or, foie gras, pate, all these things that I really had either never eaten before or hadn't eaten in nearly 2 decades. And so I found them kind of interesting and textured and earthy, rich, interesting foods, and they were strangely satisfying. And I also found that within literally like a month, I lost 10 pounds without even trying. And I went to the doctor and he said, well, your cholesterol levels look better than ever. So that was this mystery. Like, well, why should that? That seems like contrary to everything that we believe to be true about what a healthy diet is. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing. And the other was that I was assigned to write a story about trans fats by Gourmet magazine. I was writing a series of investigative food stories for the magazine. And I didn't know anything about trans fats. I started researching them. I realized there was just a much bigger story about how we had sort of gotten everything about fat wrong. Fat is what our nutrition policy is most obsessed about, low fat, non-fat, how much fat, good or bad fat. And I started interviewing these scientists who were like terrified to talk to me. They would say, I can't talk to you about dietary fat. I can't comment on that. And I would, people would hang up on me or I would get off the phone and I would be shaking, feeling like, am I investigating the mob? I mean, what is going on here? And there was a real story there about how science had been suppressed, about how scientists had been bullied and their careers had been ruined for, not sort of agreeing with the party line on dietary fat. So that was just incredibly intriguing and interesting to me as a journalist. It really perks your ears up as a journalist. There's a big story there. And so it took a long time to get to the bottom of that story.
I can see where it would draw you in. You would feel like, oh my gosh, I fell into this mystery novel. There's all this intrigue. Why are they hanging up on me? I'm just asking questions about fat.
Right. Just like, do you think it's true that maybe dietary fat is not bad for health? Is it possible that fat doesn't cause cancer? Is it possible that saturated fat maybe doesn't cause heart disease? I mean, those are still considered in many quarters to be heretical questions. And nobody wants to go onto the record, or very few people want to go on record, stating views to the contrary, because one of the things that really shocked me in my research was, you think that science proceeds kind of like calmly, logically, rationally forward, step by step. And what I realized is that is not at all the case in nutrition science. In nutrition science, and maybe in other fields too, but, people had been scientists who'd challenged their colleagues, which is supposed to be normal in science, right? To challenge ideas and discuss them and debate them. And instead, they found that they had their grants canceled. They'd be disinvited from conferences. Their careers would stall. They would get drummed out of university departments. I mean, I have dozens and dozens of stories like that from scientists who, merely because they contradicted what the official line was on, and still largely is, on dietary fat.
Now, why is that so? Why is it still largely against dietary fat? Who were trying to clamp down on this information that fat might actually not be a problem? Who's clamping down on it?
Well, I have to go back and just kind of like recast just cast the history a little bit to give some structure to the story for listeners. I mean, probably many of your listeners already know the story, but, many don't. And so just really briefly, it all started out with saturated fat. The idea that saturated fat in, meat and dairy and eggs, but also in coconut and palm oil, that kind of fat was, along with dietary cholesterol, clog the arteries and cause heart disease. That was an idea that kind of came to the fore in the 1950s, when heart disease had come from pretty much out of nowhere to be the leading number one killer. President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack in 1955 and was out of the Oval Office for 10 days. So there's this panic in the nation about what causes heart disease. And there were a number of ideas out there. Maybe it was vitamin deficiency or stress or type A personalities. But there was one idea, and that was saturated fat and cholesterol that caused heart disease. That was an idea championed by a pathologist at the University of Minnesota named Ansel Keys. And he was this very aggressive, outsized individual who got his idea implanted into the American Heart Association in 1961. And he was on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. 1961, the very first recommendations anywhere in the world to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol, official recommendation as a way to prevent heart disease. So that was just saturated fat. Then by 1970, the American Heart Association added total fats, because the thinking then was largely, look, fat is 9 calories per gram compared to 4 or 5 calories per gram for a protein or a carbohydrate, which it's only 3 macronutrients you can eat. And so it seemed just prudent to cut back on fat, because then you'd be cutting calories. By then, there was that rising idea that, all you had to do is count calories to control your weight. And then the U.S. government gets on board with the whole program, low fat, low saturated fat, low cholesterol, in 1980, the very first USDA dietary guidelines. And then the whole world pretty much copied us. We exported our dietary policy to most Western nations and the WHO. And, and then you have to understand, like, all governments, nearly all governments, World Health Organizations, all institutions, all professional associations, the American Heart Association, which is the largest nonprofit in America, everybody is in line with this idea about fat. And, fat came to be, it was believed that it didn't just cause heart disease, but it came, and probably obesity, but also maybe diabetes and cancer. And so all of that thinking has, really held true. So, until very, very recently, in 2013, the American Heart Association, they eliminated their cap on total fat. So they basically kind of started tiptoeing away from the low fat diet, right?
Yeah.
They still believe that saturated fat is bad for you, but they've dropped the total fat. So now they're saying you can eat more fat overall, but it has to be what they call the good kinds of fats. So for them, that's nuts and fish and seeds and vegetable oils. And our federal government, which has always been extremely close to the American Heart Association position, has now in the last year adopted the same recommendations. So now we're in a situation where our official recommendation is no longer the low-fat diet anymore, but that whole shift has happened so quietly and with zero public announcement, so nobody knows that the low-fat diet is no longer recommended, which is kind of extraordinary. And so people still avoid fat because they think it's bad for health. And there is still caps on saturated fat. I'm sorry, the other thing the governments and the American Heart Association both gave up was they no longer say that you have to control your dietary cholesterol, which is, egg yolks, shellfish, liver. Those foods, which we largely kind of excised from our diets in order to control your blood cholesterol, those caps are now gone too. It turns out it doesn't matter how much cholesterol you eat. Your body regulates its own cholesterol. It makes its own cholesterol. Cholesterol is an essential part of every cell of your body. So if you eat a lot, your body just downregulates its own production. That's actually been known since the late 1970s. And gradually, the U.S. is really one of the last countries to give up its caps on cholesterol.
I can just tell you, though, I get health magazines, fitness magazines, and they're still selling the low-fat stuff. You're right. This shift has not been understood by the general public and even fitness and nutrition professionals. When I saw my doctor, just a regular conventional doctor, and she's like, oh, your cholesterol numbers are a little high. So she literally gave me a sheet of paper telling me the foods to avoid, the very ones you were talking about, eggs and things that have high cholesterol in them that we, as you say, should not impact my body's cholesterol level. And yet there they were still touting that old line. And that's why I was asking you, who is afraid of this new news? Why has it been changed so quietly?
That is a really good question. And I don't really know the answer to it. I think that why have authorities kind of tiptoed away from the low-fat diet? I mean, I can give you a number of possibilities. One is that the problem of publicly reversing themselves on fat and cholesterol is hugely embarrassing and would discredit them. And I think that it's not good for a large, trusted public institution who's provided guidance on health to tell their public that they were completely flat out wrong for decades. And I think there's a growing body of evidence to show that by adopting the low-fat diet, they very possibly triggered the obesity and diabetes epidemics. So there's a growing body of evidence that showed that, because we cut back on fat since 1965, we've cut back on fat by 25%, increased carbohydrates by 30%, right? When you cut out fat, there's only 3 macronutrients. Remember, fat, protein, carbohydrates. So if you reduce fat and you're cutting out, meat and cheese and going to low-fat foods, you automatically shift over to carbohydrates. And that's what we were told to eat and are still told to eat, that big bottom slab of the food pyramid, if you remember it, grains and pasta and rice and cereals, that's all carbohydrates. So we increase carbohydrates by 30%. And there's quite a large body of evidence to show that carbohydrates are driving obesity and diabetes because of their effect on insulin. And your body really processes all those carbs as glucose, which is sugar in your body. So one possibility is it's truly embarrassing and would discredit these public institutions. I think that's probably possibilities 1, 2, and 3. Perhaps they're liable. I don't know if it's possible for a class action suit of people to say you made us fat and diabetic. I don't know. But I think there's also an element that these institutions are, especially the American Heart Association is a good portion of their funds come from food companies. Food companies, manufactured food companies make high carbohydrate, the majority of them are making cookies, crackers, chips. I mean, most of what you can buy in a supermarket that's packaged is carbohydrate based. So, they may not really want to embrace a message that would not please their funders.
That makes sense. Nina, tell me, what has happened with heart disease? Because Ansel Keys was saying if we went low fat, heart disease would reduce, right, in the general population. Did it?
Well, the mortality from heart disease, your likeliness of dying from heart disease has definitely gone down since the 1970s. And people who study this say that's because there's been large declines in smoking, and also because we get better medical care. We get diagnosed faster, get to the hospital faster, get treated. However, the underlying incidence of heart disease, it's not clear that has dropped very much. And it's still the number one killer in America. So we have not made great strides with heart disease.
We want to pause now and thank our sponsors, Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products produces fermented cod liver oil and concentrated butter oil in a variety of flavors in liquid gel and capsule form. They also offer organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, and a complete oil blend that includes all of the nourishing oils. Lastly, they produce skincare balms and various byproducts that enrich the soil and feed of farm animals. Go to greenpastureproducts.com. And the Weston A. Price Foundation. Good news! We have a contest for an opportunity to win a free registration for the conference in Montgomery, Alabama this November. Simply go to westonaprice.org, click on Enter to Win by Wednesday, October 12th, and you will have the opportunity to join us for free. For the rest of you, we are lowering the price for everyone. Everyone can register to the conference at the membership rate. Simply go to wisetraditions.org and put in the code WAPF for that discounted rate for the conference. We're trying to make it so all of you can come, or as many as possible. Thanks for listening and hope to see you in November. Going back to your book, The Big Fat Surprise, and all the research you did, what are some stories of how people's health has improved as they've switched their diet to include more fat?
Well, I go back in my book and I tell a lot of stories of populations that were healthy on high-fat diets and in the scientific literature, because I wanted to document the vast amount of observations. In science, these are known as observations, that populations that had to be ignored in order to believe Ansel Keys and the American Heart Association, right? So at the time they were pushing their hypothesis, people always ask me, like, it can't just be Ansel Keys, right? Of course not. It was, many people were involved, but and people want to know, weren't there critics? Was there no data to the contrary? Didn't people understand? And so it's important to document, to show, yes, there was a lot of documentation of populations eating high-fat diets and being very healthy, and that being in the scientific literature. So, for example, there was a population in Roseto, Pennsylvania in the 1970s where they were studied by scientists. They were Italian immigrants. They would eat a very high-fat diet, described as like they cooked everything in lard. They ate prosciutto with an inch rim of fat around the outside.
Wow.
They ate fatty meals, and yet they followed them for 2 years and didn't find a single incidence of a heart attack amongst a middle-aged male population in the 1970s. That was documented in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition and completely ignored. Another great example that people tend to maybe know about is professor at the University of Vanderbilt, George Mann, went to Uganda and studied the Maasai warriors, who were a tribe that ate, he found that he took electrocardiograms of them and found that of 600 of them found almost no trace of a heart attack. He found that their cholesterol was low and did not rise with age, which was sort of unheard of in Western populations. Mm-hmm. And then he discovered what they ate, which is that they ate 3 to 5 pounds of meat a day, and they ate blood and milk, and that was it. Their entire diet, completely failing by any USDA standard diet. And he actually followed some of them to Nairobi to see, if they changed their diet, did they have some kind of genetic exception?
Yes.
But when he followed them to Nairobi and they started eating a more Western diet, he found that actually their cholesterol did go up like other people's did. So there didn't seem to have any kind of unique protection. That was also published in prime journals in the 1970s and also ignored. So, and there are many, many other examples like this, and they're important to say, they're important to mention, not because any of us is advocating eating meat, blood, and milk, although it worked for the Maasai warriors, or having a high fatty diet like that for everyone, but it's important to understand those observations did not fit Ansel Keys' hypothesis. And so when, if you're a scientist, if you have observations that don't fit your hypothesis, you are supposed to, what you're supposed to do is reconsider your hypothesis. Maybe there's something wrong with it. Maybe I got it wrong, is what a scientist is supposed to do. And that is just repeatedly what did not happen in nutrition science and still doesn't happen. I mean, I just want to, today, Americans have, again, cut fat by 25% and increased carbohydrates by 30% since 1965. We've cut back, in the last 30 years, we've cut back on red meat by 17%, whole milk by 73%, animal fats in general by 17%. We've increased grains by 41%, vegetable oils by 91%. Everything we were told to do by the dietary guidelines, we have done. We have followed the dietary guidelines. Vegetable and fruit consumption has gone up. Both of those, green leafy vegetables have gone up by like 200% in the last 30 years. Yet, look how we look. Look at our health.
Wow.
Our health is terrible and getting worse. And in fact, the obesity epidemic really took off in 1980, which is the very first year the dietary guidelines were published. So another like glaring observation right in our face. And you would think that scientists would say, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe the dietary guidelines got it wrong.
And now some of them are starting to, as you said, recognize that maybe we did get it wrong. There's small changes and shifts as you've described. How can we, as a populace, how can I start to change my diet to include more healthy fats?
Well, the first thing to do is not to fear fat. Those of us, we've all grown up fearing that the fat in your food and your bacon and your cheese is going to become the fat on your body. It's what I call the tragic homonym. The fat you eat and the fat you get. You do not get fat from eating fat. And that basic fear you have to overcome. What translates into fatty acids in your bloodstream, actually, are carbohydrates. They convert into fatty acids in your blood. So the fat you eat is not the fat you get. Fat will not make you fat. It's been shown fat will not give you cancer. Saturated fat, there have been 17 now meta-analyses and systematic reviews showing that saturated fats has no effect on cardiovascular mortality. So how do you take that information and incorporate that into your own diet? Well, one thing you do is you just increase the amount of fat that you eat. I mean, there's a large body of clinical trial evidence now showing that if you reduce carbohydrates a little bit and increase fat, keep protein constant. It's not a high protein diet, but a high fat diet. Like, over 40% of your calories fat. People go up to 70 or 80% fat on some diets. That is a healthier diet. And that the good fats are actually the opposite of what you've been told. So vegetable oils, which is what we're told to eat, it turns out that in many experiments that were done in the 60s and 70s that were basically ignored and suppressed, but the results of those found that vegetable oils increased rates of cancer. And they're highly volatile and unstable, especially when they're heated. So they're really, really terrible for cooking. They oxidize into hundreds of oxidation products, and some of which are known toxins. So first thing to do is to get rid of vegetable oils, even for cooking. I'm saying soybean, corn, canola, any of those I would get rid of. I think if you want to use an oil, like for salad dressings, use olive oil, because unique in that it's mostly oleic acid, which only has one double bond, therefore only one chance for reacting with oxygen and oxidizing, and therefore more stable as compared to polyunsaturated fats with poly means many, many double bonds, many opportunities to react with oxygen and oxidize, and therefore highly unstable. So for anytime you want to use oil, it's best to use monounsaturated olive oil. So olive oil basically is the best. For cooking, it's best to cook with saturated fats. Contrary to everything that we've been told, saturated fats do not cause heart disease, and they're solid.
Yeah.
One of the things that solidity means is that they are not volatile. They do not oxidize. There are zero double bonds, and so they cannot react with oxygen, so they do not degrade. They don't go rancid. So good cooking fats are lard, tallow, coconut oil or coconut butter, ghee, all solid, stable, good cooking fat. Your grandmother very likely cooked her bacon, saved the bacon drippings. Maybe, I pour mine through a coffee filter, and then save them and use them for cooking later on.
Yeah.
It's economical. When duck fat is, $5 a little for a little tub, it's very economical just to use your own lard. And there are a number of companies, many, many more companies now make these products and high quality products. And then, not to fear those foods that we fear. Definitely, there's no harm in eating meat. Meat does not cause cancer. I could go into, for an hour on that science, but, meat is fine. And definitely whole fat dairy has been shown now in quite a number of experiments, randomized controlled clinical trials, which is a rigorous kind of data to show that whole fat dairy is healthier, leads to better outcomes in terms of weight and diabetes and heart disease. So whole fat dairy is the way to go. Don't avoid eggs. We avoided eggs because we were afraid of cholesterol. Cholesterol is not a problem. So, going back to the way that people used to eat these ancient foods, they are healthy and they're fine. And then to avoid low-fat foods, because anytime they strip out the fat out of a food, fat conveys texture and flavor. So they need to use fat replacers, and it's what's the jargon in the industry. And fat replacers, in order to restore those qualities, those are almost all carbohydrate-based and usually just sugar. So low-fat foods tend to be higher in carbohydrates and often are higher in sugar.
Mm-hmm. So there is a scientific...
Get rid of those.
Thank you. I love what you're saying, and I'm just like, amen, amen, in my head, because not only is there scientific support for this and anecdotal or observational, as you said, but it also tastes amazing. I hasten to add how great these natural foods taste. You can put all the fat replacers in the food to try to make it match something that's naturally got fat. But when you eat the real deal, it's just so satiating, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, fat is satiating, so it fills you up. And then it's, and it's been shown that people are less likely to overeat then because, they're satiated, right? And so then that's one of the reasons that a higher fat diet makes it easier to lose weight, because people are just naturally not overeating. And yes, it's completely delicious. I mean, as I myself, I lived, I think, through my entire 20s on, rice cakes and chicken breasts without the skin and no oil on my salad. And I don't know how I lived with all those tasteless foods. I mean, somehow I survived, but it's food is so much more pleasurable when you can, spoon over a creamy sauce onto your meat or, have some wonderful fresh butter on a cracker. I mean, it's like a revelation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, Nina, we're going to have to wrap up. And of course, I have more questions I want to ask you. Maybe we'll do a part 2 when I see you at the conference. I can't wait.
Well, that would be great.
But I do want to ask you before we close up, what is one thing the listener can do to improve their health?
I think reducing carbohydrates, particularly sugar, refined carbohydrates, and increasing fat in your diet, healthy fat, saturated fat, is probably the single best way to improve health.
Fantastic. Well, I hope every listener takes your advice, and I look forward to our next conversation. Take care.
All right, you too. Thanks very much for having me.
My guest today was Nina Teicholz. Go to her website, thebigfatsurprise.com, to check out her book, her blog, and other resources. Or just go to the westnaprice.org website, click on the podcast page, and go to show notes for episode 45. Hey, and a big thank you to Podcast Village for your tech and editing support. We appreciate you all so much. You help us sound good, and we know our listeners love that too. Thanks, guys.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westonaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.